Welcome to the Billionaire's Choice. Subscribe and turn on notifications to enjoy more heartwarming stories of love and destiny. Let us know where you're watching from, and let's begin today's story. The people you judge the fastest are sometimes the ones willing to sacrifice everything for you. If anyone had whispered those words to Tessa Rowan that Monday morning, she would have laughed without hesitation. As the senior executive assistant at Mercer Dynamics, she believed there was no colder man on earth than Dylan Mercer. At 36, the billionaire founder and chief executive officer had built one of America's fastest-growing technology companies through impossible standards, relentless discipline, and an expression that rarely changed. Employees respected him, investors admired him, and business magazines called him a visionary. Tessa called him emotionally unavailable. She had spent the last 2 years chasing impossible deadlines, rewriting presentations because a chart was half an inch out of alignment, rearranging meetings at midnight, and canceling family dinners because Dylan's schedule always came first. He never shouted. He never insulted anyone. Somehow, his quiet perfection made everyone around him work twice as hard. To Tessa, that was even worse. She often wondered if the man possessed a heart beneath those perfectly tailored charcoal suits. That morning, the executive floor buzzed with anticipation. Mercer Dynamics was flying to Colorado to finalize the largest partnership in company history, a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Every department had worked for months preparing for this meeting. Tessa balanced a laptop, a leather folder packed with contracts, and a cup of coffee as she hurried toward Dylan's office. Before she could knock, the door opened. Dylan stepped into the hallway carrying only a slim portfolio and a silver aviation watch that never seemed to leave his wrist. His sharp blue eyes met hers for only a second. Presentation? He asked. Finished. Investor reports? Updated. Flight schedule. Private departure in 45 minutes. He nodded once. Good. That single word ended the conversation, just as it always did. As he walked away, Tessa muttered under her breath. One day you might actually say thank you. He either did not hear her or chose not to respond. She could not decide which possibility annoyed her more. Less than an hour later, they boarded the company's sleek private jet outside Seattle. Rain tapped softly against the windows while the crew welcomed everyone aboard. Dylan immediately opened financial documents, completely absorbed in numbers before the aircraft even left the runway. Tessa settled across from him, determined to spend the flight reviewing the presentation instead of looking at the man who somehow made silence feel exhausting. The aircraft climbed smoothly into gray skies, leaving the city beneath a blanket of clouds. For nearly 30 minutes, everything remained perfectly ordinary. Then the captain's calm voice came through the cabin speakers. Unexpected storm activity ahead. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened. The first few bumps were easy to ignore. The next ones were not. Rain slammed against the windows with increasing force as towering clouds swallowed every trace of daylight. The aircraft rolled sharply before leveling again. Coffee spilled across the table between them. Dylan calmly closed his laptop before it could slide away and secured the leather portfolio beneath his seat. Tessa tightened her seat belt, trying to hide the growing fear in her eyes. Lightning flashed outside, turning the cabin bright white for a heartbeat before darkness returned. Another violent jolt shook the aircraft. The overhead lights flickered. Flight attendants hurried into their seats. Even Dylan finally looked away from business and toward the storm. The captain spoke again, his voice still controlled but noticeably more serious. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing severe weather and changing conditions. Please remain calm while we work through the situation. Tessa gripped the armrests until her knuckles turned pale. Dylan glanced at her for the first time that day. Breathe, he said quietly. Panic will not help. She looked back at him with frustration. You really think now is the time for another lesson? Before he could answer, the aircraft suddenly dropped through empty air. Gasps echoed throughout the cabin. Loose objects slid across the floor. Warning chimes filled the silence as another flash of lightning illuminated endless mountains beneath the storm. Then came a deafening impact unlike anything either of them had ever imagined. The world exploded into noise, darkness, and twisting metal. Hours later, when Tessa finally opened her eyes beneath towering pine trees soaked by cold rain, the boardroom no longer existed. The billion-dollar deal no longer existed. There was no chief executive officer. There was no executive assistant. There were only two survivors standing alone in the heart of an unforgiving forest. Cold rain dripped steadily from the towering pines as Tessa Rowan forced herself upright, every muscle protesting after the crash. Her ears still rang, and the forest seemed impossibly quiet except for the distant sound of rushing water somewhere beyond the trees. Broken branches littered the ground around the narrow clearing where pieces of the aircraft had come to rest. Smoke drifted upward through the mist, reminding her how close they had come to losing everything. She turned in every direction, searching for another familiar face, but there was only one. Dylan Mercer was kneeling several yards away beside a section of the aircraft, breathing heavily as he examined the scattered emergency supplies. His expensive suit was torn, streaked with mud, and soaked from the rain, making him look less like one of the wealthiest men in America and more like an exhausted traveler who had wandered into the wilderness by accident. "Is anyone else alive?" Tessa asked, her voice trembling. Dylan paused before meeting her eyes. "I looked as far as I safely could. I have not found anyone." The weight of those words settled between them. Tessa fought back tears, refusing to let panic take control. "We have to keep looking." Dylan nodded. "We will. But first we need water, shelter, and whatever supplies survived." His calm tone irritated her instantly. People could still need help. And if we collapse from exhaustion before we find them, we become another problem. She glared at him. "You always think like a machine." "No," he answered quietly. "I think about staying alive." She turned away without replying. Together they searched the scattered debris, recovering a small emergency backpack, a folded paper map sealed inside a waterproof sleeve, a compact first aid kit, a metal water bottle, a silver aviation watch that Dylan picked up without saying a word, and a sturdy multi-tool tucked inside an emergency compartment. Dylan also found a single emergency signal flare sealed inside a waterproof tube. After checking that it was still intact, he carefully slipped it into the backpack. "One flare," he said quietly. "We only get one chance with this. We save it until we know someone can actually see it." Tessa nodded, realizing that every item now carried the weight of survival. He slipped the knife into his pocket before handing the map to Tessa. "Keep this dry," he said. "It may matter later." She reluctantly accepted it. They followed the sound of running water until a narrow stream appeared beneath the trees, its clear current winding between moss-covered rocks. Dylan filled the bottle while Tessa knelt to wash dirt from her hands. Neither spoke. Hunger soon replaced shock. Dylan searched the surrounding area with careful attention, identifying edible berries only after checking them against the survival guide packed inside the emergency kit. Tessa watched him with growing confusion. "How do you know all of this?" she asked. "Later," he replied. "Right now we need shelter before dark." His answer only deepened her frustration. They gathered fallen branches and broad, evergreen boughs, but every suggestion became another argument. Tessa wanted to stay close to the crash site. Dylan insisted they move to higher ground in case the weather worsened. She accused him of always needing to control everything. He answered that the mountain would not care about either of their opinions. Eventually, she followed him uphill, more out of necessity than agreement. Together, they constructed a simple lean-to against the trunk of an enormous pine, covering it with layers of branches to keep out the rain. As Dylan cut another limb with the multi-tool, the wetwood shifted unexpectedly beneath his weight. He stumbled and struck his shoulder hard against a jagged fallen log. He caught himself before falling completely, but a sharp breath escaped his lips. Tessa hurried toward him despite herself. "Do not move," she said. Dylan attempted to stand anyway, only to wince as pain spread across his shoulder. She sighed in frustration. For someone who plans everything, that was careless. "I have made worse mistakes," he admitted. Opening the first aid kit, Tessa carefully cleaned the scrape and wrapped his shoulder with a bandage, her movements gentle even though her expression remained guarded. Dylan watched her in silence. "Thank you," he said sincerely. She tied the final knot without looking at him. "Do not misunderstand. I still do not like you. I just do not want my only chance of getting out of this forest to lose the use of his arm." For the first time since they had met, the corner of Dylan's mouth lifted into the faintest hint of a smile as the last light of day disappeared beyond the endless trees and the cold wilderness settled around the two unwilling companions. Morning arrived quietly beneath a blanket of silver mist, And for the first time since the crash, Tessa Rowan realized how completely the forest had swallowed the outside world. The sounds of traffic, phones, and endless meetings had been replaced by birds calling high above the trees and the steady rush of the stream below their shelter. She woke to find the fire already burning. Dylan Mercer was kneeling beside it, feeding carefully selected branches into the glowing coals without producing much smoke. He noticed her stirring but said nothing, simply handing her a cup of warm water that he had heated over the fire. She accepted it with a quiet nod, still unwilling to admit how much she appreciated the gesture. "When did you wake up?" she asked. "Before sunrise." "You built the fire by yourself?" Dylan looked toward the dark ashes surrounding the flames. Keeping warm seemed more useful than sleeping. Tessa frowned. She had watched enough survival shows to know how difficult starting a fire could be after heavy rain. The wood surrounding them was soaked, yet somehow he had found dry material hidden beneath fallen logs and inside hollow branches. She studied him for a moment before taking another sip. "You make this look easy." "It is easier when you know where to look." That answer only created more questions. After a simple breakfast of berries and clean water, Dylan unfolded the paper map they had recovered from the wreckage. Although it was designed for aviation routes rather than hiking trails, he carefully compared it with the surrounding mountain ridges and the direction of the stream. Tessa watched him quietly. "Can you actually read that?" she asked. "Not perfectly," he replied. "But rivers usually lead somewhere, and mountains tell you more than most people realize." She folded her arms. "You sound like someone who has done this before." Dylan glanced at her, then back at the map. "Maybe." It was another answer that revealed almost nothing. They spent the morning exploring the area, marking the route back to their shelter by tying small strips of fabric onto low branches. Dylan moved through the forest with surprising confidence, paying attention to details Tessa would never have noticed. He paused to examine animal tracks pressed into soft mud, checked the direction of moss growing on tree trunks, and occasionally looked toward the sky, even when thick clouds covered most of it. By midday, the weather finally cleared enough for patches of blue to appear overhead. Dylan stopped beside a small clearing and looked upward for several seconds before quietly changing direction. "What are you doing?" Tessa asked. "Finding west." She laughed softly. "Without a compass?" He pointed toward the sun breaking through the clouds. "The shadows are enough for now. Tonight the stars will tell us more." She stared at him in disbelief. "Who exactly are you?" Dylan smiled faintly without answering. Later that afternoon, he used the multi-tool to cut several flexible branches before weaving them together with strips of bark into a simple snare. Tessa watched every movement with growing curiosity. "That is not something a billionaire learns during board meetings." "No," he admitted. "It is not." "Then where did you learn?" Dylan tightened the final knot before standing. "From someone who believed every skill has value, even if you hope never to use it." Again he stopped there, leaving the rest of the story hidden. As evening approached, the temperature dropped quickly. Dylan gathered fresh firewood while Tessa collected water from the stream. When she returned, she found him studying the first stars beginning to appear through the clearing sky. He quietly named the brightest constellations before estimating the direction they needed to travel if rescue did not arrive within the next few days. Tessa stood beside him in complete silence. The man she thought she knew was disappearing piece by piece. The ruthless executive who measured presentations down to fractions of an inch had become someone who could build shelter from branches, start a fire after heavy rain, navigate without technology, and prepare traps with practiced hands. None of it made sense. Somewhere beneath the polished image of Dylan Mercer lived another man entirely, and as the firelight flickered across his face, Tessa realized she no longer feared the wilderness as much as she feared discovering who he truly was. Dark clouds gathered with startling speed, swallowing the last traces of twilight until the forest seemed to vanish beneath a curtain of gray. Tessa Rowan looked up just as the first heavy raindrops struck the leaves above them. Within seconds, the gentle drizzle became a relentless downpour, drumming against the canopy so loudly that conversation became almost impossible. Dylan Mercer folded the paper map, slipped it carefully back into its waterproof sleeve, and scanned the steep hillside. "We cannot stay here," he said calmly. "The ground will flood." Tessa followed his gaze toward a narrow ridge of exposed rock. "Where do we go?" Dylan pointed through the rain. I saw a small opening in the cliff earlier today. It looked deep enough to keep us dry. Without wasting another moment, they gathered their few belongings. Dylan extinguished the fire to prevent it from spreading if the wind changed, then tucked the multi-tool into his pocket before leading the way uphill. The rain turned the forest floor slick with mud, forcing them to move carefully between roots and moss-covered stones. Several times Tessa lost her footing, and each time Dylan instinctively reached back to steady her before continuing without a word. Nearly 20 minutes later, they found the narrow cave hidden behind a curtain of hanging vines. It was not large, but it offered shelter from the rain and enough space for both of them to rest. Water trickled down the rocky entrance while the deeper chamber remained dry and surprisingly warm. Dylan gathered loose branches from beneath the rocky overhang and soon coaxed a small fire to life using dry bark he had collected earlier. Orange light danced across the stone walls, replacing the cold blue shadows with quiet warmth. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. They simply listened to the storm outside as rain echoed against the mountains. Tessa wrapped her arms around her knees, watching the flames. "I used to think silence meant someone did not care," she said quietly. Dylan remained focused on adjusting the fire. "And now," she looked at him across the flickering light, "now I am beginning to think some people simply carry things they never learned how to say." Dylan let out a slow breath before answering. "That is closer to the truth." The cave fell silent again. Outside, thunder rolled through the valley, followed by another burst of rain. Tessa studied the man across from her. The polished billionaire she had known inside glass offices seemed impossibly distant now. His expensive suit was torn, his hands were scratched from gathering wood, and exhaustion showed beneath his calm expression. "Where did you learn all of this?" she asked softly. This time he did not avoid the question. "From my mother." Tessa looked surprised. Dylan stared into the fire as memories slowly returned. "We were poor. Very poor. We lived in a small cabin near the mountains for several years after my father disappeared. My mother believed that every skill was worth learning because life could change without warning. She taught me how to build fires after rain, how to read the stars, how to find clean water, and how to keep moving when everything felt hopeless." His voice remained steady, but the sadness behind it was impossible to miss. "She passed away when I was 17. By then I already knew survival had nothing to do with money." Tessa lowered her eyes. Suddenly the man who obsessed over preparation made perfect sense. After a long silence, Dylan looked toward her. "What about you?" Tessa hesitated before speaking. "My father left when I was 9. One day he promised we would go fishing that weekend. He never came home." She forced a faint smile that disappeared almost immediately. "After that, every wealthy man I met seemed to remind me of him. They always had somewhere more important to be." Dylan listened without interrupting. "So when I started working for you," she continued, "I convinced myself you were exactly the same. Brilliant, successful, and emotionally unreachable." Dylan nodded slowly. "I understand why you believe that." "Do you?" she asked. "Because I never gave you a reason to believe otherwise." Their eyes met across the fire. For the first time since the crash, there was no resentment, no title, and no invisible wall separating employer from employee. There were only two people carrying different wounds, discovering that pain often wears quieter faces than anyone expects. As the storm raged beyond the cave entrance, neither of them noticed how the distance between them had quietly disappeared, replaced by something far stronger than obligation. Trust had arrived without asking permission, carried not by grand promises, but by shared silence, honest memories, and the warmth of a small fire in the middle of an endless forest. The storm finally drifted east sometime before dawn, leaving behind a forest washed clean by the rain. Sunlight filtered through the towering pines, casting long golden beams across the damp ground outside the cave. Tessa Rowan stepped into the cool morning air, breathing deeply as the scent of wet earth and evergreen filled her lungs. For the first time since the crash, the world seemed almost peaceful. Dylan Mercer emerged a few moments later, his injured shoulder noticeably stiff despite the bandage Tessa had wrapped the day before. He tried to hide the discomfort, but she noticed the slight hesitation every time he lifted his left arm. "You should rest another day," she said. Dylan glanced toward the endless forest stretching beyond the valley. "If rescue teams are searching, we should keep moving toward higher ground. They will have a better chance of seeing us." Tessa wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. After sharing the last of the berries they had gathered, they packed their few belongings. Dylan carefully slipped the folded paper map into his jacket, secured the multi-tool to his belt, checked the silver aviation watch that had stopped forever at the exact moment of the crash, and quietly placed it back into his pocket. Hours passed as they followed a narrow ridgeline overlooking the forest below. Dylan frequently paused to study the terrain, comparing distant peaks with the map while searching for landmarks that might lead them toward civilization. Tessa followed closely behind, noticing that his pace had slowed. His shoulder clearly hurt more than he admitted, yet he refused to complain. By early afternoon, they reached a peaceful clearing where a shallow stream curved between smooth stones. Tessa knelt to refill the water bottle while Dylan searched nearby for edible plants. Suddenly, the birds surrounding the clearing erupted into flight. The forest, which had been alive with sound only moments earlier, became strangely quiet. Dylan froze instantly. His eyes scanned the tree line. "Tessa," he said softly, never looking away from the shadows ahead. "Come here." Slowly, she immediately sensed the change in his voice. Without asking questions, she stood and walked toward him. A large black bear emerged from behind a cluster of bushes several yards away, attracted by the scent of food and the unfamiliar activity near the stream. The animal paused, studying the two strangers with cautious curiosity. Tessa instinctively stepped backward, her breathing becoming uneven. Dylan slowly moved in front of her without hesitation. "Do not run," he whispered. "Stay behind me." Every instinct told Tessa to flee, but something in Dylan's calm confidence kept her rooted in place. He raised his arms carefully, making himself appear larger while speaking in a firm, steady voice. The bear hesitated, watching him closely. Dylan reached into his pocket and slowly removed the multi-tool, not as a weapon, but to strike its metal handle gently against a nearby rock. The sharp metallic sound echoed through the clearing. The bear lifted its head, uncertain. Dylan continued speaking calmly, while guiding Tessa backward one careful step at a time. Suddenly, the bear took several quick strides forward. Dylan immediately pushed Tessa behind a thick pine tree, placing himself between her and the animal. As he moved, his injured shoulder slammed hard against the rough trunk, forcing a painful gasp from his lips. The unexpected sound, combined with another loud strike of metal against stone, caused the bear to stop. After several long seconds that felt like an eternity, it turned away, disappearing silently into the dense forest. Neither of them moved until the surrounding birds slowly began singing again. Tessa rushed toward Dylan. He leaned against the tree, breathing heavily, one hand pressed against his shoulder. Fresh blood had soaked through part of the bandage where the old injury had reopened. "Sit down," she said firmly. This time he did not argue. She carefully removed the damaged bandage from the first aid kit, cleaned the wound again, and wrapped his shoulder with slow, gentle hands. "You stepped in front of me," she whispered. Dylan looked toward the trees where the bear had vanished. There was never another choice. Tessa finished tying the bandage before quietly pulling a clean white handkerchief from her pocket. She folded it and tucked it carefully beneath the sling to cushion his shoulder from rubbing against the fabric. "Keep it," she said. "You will need it more than I will." Dylan looked at the small handkerchief for a long moment before meeting her eyes. "If only one of us makes it home," he said softly. "Make it count." Tears gathered in Tessa's eyes as she gently squeezed his uninjured hand. "No," she replied with quiet determination. "We both make it home. That is the only ending I am willing to accept." The following morning arrived with a sky so clear that it almost seemed impossible to believe the storm had ever existed. Sunlight spilled across the endless sea of pine trees, and for the first time in days, warmth replaced the damp chill that had settled into every layer of Dylan Mercer's torn suit and Tessa Rowan's weather-worn clothes. They climbed steadily toward the highest ridge they could see, believing that if rescuers were searching from the air, elevation offered their best chance of being found. Dylan's shoulder remained wrapped beneath the white handkerchief Tessa had tucked beneath the bandage, and although every step caused him discomfort, he refused to slow their progress. Tessa noticed the tightness in his jaw each time he lifted himself over fallen logs, but she also understood that asking him to stop would accomplish nothing. By midday, they finally reached an exposed granite outcrop overlooking miles of untouched wilderness. The view stole their breath. Mountains stretched across the horizon in every direction, divided by rivers that glimmered beneath the afternoon sun. Somewhere beyond those ridges lay roads, towns, and the ordinary lives they desperately wanted to return to. Tessa scanned the sky while Dylan unfolded the paper map one more time, comparing valleys and peaks with remarkable patience. Suddenly, he stopped speaking. "Listen," he said quietly. At first, she heard nothing except the wind. Then a faint rhythmic sound drifted through the valley. It grew louder with every passing second until there was no mistaking it. Helicopter blades. Tessa's eyes widened. They found us. Both of them sprang into action. Dylan gathered dry branches while Tessa searched frantically for anything that might produce visible smoke. Together they built a small signal fire on the highest rock and fed it with damp pine needles, creating a thick column of gray smoke that climbed toward the cloudless sky. The sound of the helicopter grew stronger. Through a break in the trees, a rescue aircraft finally appeared, flying low along the opposite side of the valley. Tessa waved both arms above her head. Dylan removed his dark jacket and swung it in wide circles, standing on the edge of the ridge despite the pain in his shoulder. "Over here," Tessa shouted until her voice became hoarse. The helicopter seemed to hesitate for a brief moment, banking slightly as though someone had noticed movement below. Hope exploded between them. Then, slowly, almost painfully, the aircraft turned away and continued following the river toward another section of the mountains before disappearing behind the distant cliffs. Silence returned as quickly as it had vanished. Tessa lowered her arms. The smoke from their fire drifted harmlessly into an empty sky. She sank onto the warm stone without saying a word, staring toward the place where the helicopter had disappeared. Dylan remained standing for several long moments before quietly sitting beside her. Neither of them spoke. Words felt too small for the disappointment they carried. After what seemed like forever, Tessa whispered, "We were so close." Dylan nodded once. "Yes. Do you think they will come back?" He looked across the endless forest before answering honestly. "I do not know." Tears gathered in her eyes, not from fear alone, but from the crushing weight of hope slipping away. "I kept imagining walking through my front door again," she said. "I kept thinking my mother would never know how close I came to never seeing her again." Dylan listened without interrupting. Finally he spoke, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "I used to think success would make loneliness disappear." Tessa turned toward him. "Did it?" He smiled sadly. "No. It simply made it easier for people to admire what I built instead of knowing who I was." He picked up a small stone and rolled it between his fingers. People wanted the company, the influence, the money, the decisions. Very few wanted Dylan. Somewhere along the way, I stopped believing anyone ever would. Tessa felt something inside her shift. The man sitting beside her no longer resembled the distant executive she had resented for 2 years. He was simply another human being carrying invisible scars. Without thinking, she reached over and gently rested her hand on his uninjured arm. "I know you now," she said softly. Dylan looked at her, surprised by the quiet certainty in her voice. For the first time since the crash, neither of them searched the sky. They simply sat together on the mountain ridge as the afternoon sun slowly crossed above the forest, discovering that sometimes the greatest rescue begins long before anyone arrives to take you home. The next morning began with an unusual stillness. A thin blanket of fog drifted through the towering pines, softening the edges of the mountains that surrounded Dylan Mercer and Tessa Rowan. Neither of them mentioned the helicopter they had lost the day before. The disappointment still lingered between them, but it no longer felt like a wall. Instead, it had become something they silently carried together. After a modest breakfast of berries and fresh water from the stream, Dylan spread the worn paper map across a flat rock. The corners had become creased from days of careful use, yet it remained their only guide. Tessa knelt beside him, tracing the winding river marked on the map. "If we keep following the water," she said, "eventually it has to lead somewhere." Dylan nodded. "Eventually. The question is whether we reach help before the mountains become more dangerous." As he folded the map, a small leather pouch slipped from the inside pocket of his jacket. It landed quietly on the ground. Dylan reached for it immediately, but Tessa had already picked it up. "Sorry," she said, handing it back. The pouch had opened just enough for several folded papers to slide into her hands. One document immediately caught her attention. It was a hospital invoice. Her eyes widened as she recognized the patient name. Margaret Rowan. Her mother. Tessa froze. The date was almost 2 years old, shortly before her mother's heart surgery. She remembered the impossible medical bills that had somehow disappeared after the hospital informed her that an anonymous donor had settled the balance in full. She had spent months wondering who could have done something so generous. Slowly, she looked up at Dylan. "Why do you have this?" Dylan remained silent. His expression revealed that he already knew what she had discovered. "Dylan," her voice trembled. "Why is my mother's hospital bill in your pocket?" He gently accepted the papers from her hands and stared at them for several seconds before answering. "Because I never intended for you to find out." She shook her head, unable to process his words. "You paid for her surgery?" He gave a small nod. "She needed treatment immediately. Human Resources mentioned you were trying to arrange unpaid leave while searching for financial assistance. By then I had already spoken with the hospital." Tessa stared at him in complete disbelief. "Why would you do that?" "Because your mother deserved another chance." Tears began filling her eyes. "You never told me." "That was not the point." Her heart pounded harder as another memory surfaced. The year before, when company restructuring threatened dozens of administrative positions, she had somehow kept her job despite being one of the newest employees. She had assumed it was luck. "The restructuring," she whispered. "That was you too." Dylan looked away toward the forest. "Some executives believed your department could be reduced. They were wrong. You protected my position. I protected someone who worked harder than almost anyone else in the building." Tessa could barely breathe. Every belief she had carried about Dylan over the past 2 years began collapsing one piece at a time. She remembered every evening she had complained about his impossible standards, every conversation where she called him cold, every moment she had convinced herself that he never noticed the people around him. Yet all along he had quietly stood between her and problems she never even knew existed. "Why did you never tell me any of this?" she asked through tears. Dylan smiled faintly, though sadness lingered behind his eyes. "Because kindness loses something when it expects recognition." Silence settled over the forest once again. Birds called from somewhere high in the trees while sunlight slowly burned away the morning fog. Tessa stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. "I judged you before I ever tried to understand you," she said softly. "I thought I knew exactly who you were." Dylan shook his head. "Most people did. I made it easy." Without another word, Tessa wrapped her arms around him in a quiet embrace, careful not to disturb his injured shoulder. Dylan hesitated for only a moment before gently returning the embrace. It was not driven by romance or obligation. It was gratitude, forgiveness, and the beginning of something neither of them had expected to find in the middle of an endless forest. As they continued their journey later that morning, the mountains around them looked exactly the same, but the path ahead no longer felt like two strangers trying to survive. It felt like two hearts finally walking in the same direction. By the following afternoon, the mountains had changed once again. Thick clouds rolled across the sky with little warning, and the peaceful trails Dylan Mercer and Tessa Rowan had followed that morning became darker beneath the towering pines. The air carried the unmistakable scent of another storm. Dylan stopped beside the folded paper map, studying the narrow valley ahead before glancing toward the fast-moving stream that had guided them for days. "We should cross now," he said. "If the rain reaches the higher elevations first, this river will rise faster than it looks." Tessa nodded without argument. Trust had quietly replaced the resistance that once defined every conversation between them. They gathered their few belongings. Dylan slipped the silver aviation watch into his jacket pocket, secured the multi-tool to his belt, and handed the compass to Tessa. "Keep this with you," he said. "If we become separated, keep moving east." She looked at him firmly. "We are not getting separated." He smiled, a genuine smile she would never have imagined seeing only a week earlier. Together they stepped carefully into the cold current. At first the water reached only their knees, flowing steadily around smooth rocks. Then thunder echoed somewhere beyond the mountains. Within moments rain began falling upstream, and the gentle river transformed before their eyes. Water rushed between the rocks with growing force, swirling around fallen branches carried from higher ground. "Move," Dylan called. They continued toward the opposite bank, but halfway across a powerful surge slammed into Dylan's injured side. His weakened shoulder lost its grip. On a large boulder, and the current pulled him several feet downstream. The paper map slipped from his jacket before catching against a low branch near the bank. Dylan reached for another rock, but the rushing water spun him sideways. "Dylan!" Tessa shouted. Without stopping to think, she secured the compass inside her pocket, grabbed a long fallen tree limb from the riverbank, and stepped back into the freezing current. Every instinct warned her to stay where she was, yet the memory of his quiet kindness, his sacrifice, and every truth she had learned about him pushed away her fear. She fought against the current until she reached a stable rock. "Take my hand," she cried, extending the branch toward him. Dylan caught the end with his good arm, but another wave struck before he could pull himself closer. The branch bent sharply. Tessa braced her feet against the rocks and held on with everything she had. "Do not let go," she whispered through clenched teeth. Dylan looked directly at her. "You could be pulled in too. Then we both climb out together." Inch by inch, she pulled the branch backward while Dylan pushed against the riverbed with his remaining strength. Finally, his hand reached hers. She gripped it tightly and refused to release it until both of them collapsed onto the muddy riverbank, soaked, exhausted, and breathing hard beneath the pouring rain. For several long moments, neither spoke. Tessa laughed first, the kind of relieved laughter that only comes after fear has passed. Dylan looked at her with quiet gratitude. "You saved my life." She shook her head gently. "You saved mine first." Before either of them could say more, a sudden flash reflected across the wet treetops. Dylan lifted his head. High above the valley, sunlight broke through the storm just enough to reveal the polished surface of his silver aviation watch lying on a nearby rock, where it had fallen during the struggle. The bright reflection shot upward into the clearing sky. Seconds later, another familiar sound drifted across the mountains. Helicopter blades. This time the aircraft flew directly toward the valley instead of away from it. Tessa quickly recovered the signal flare they had, found among the emergency supplies days earlier, but had carefully protected from the rain. Dylan struck the multi-tool against the igniter, and a brilliant column of red light burst upward through the thinning clouds. The helicopter slowed, circled once above the river, and then turned directly toward them. Dylan looked at the compass still clutched in Tessa's hand and smiled. "It kept us moving east," he said quietly. "Without it, we never would have reached the search corridor." Tessa looked down at the small brass compass before closing her fingers around it, finally understanding that the simplest tool had guided them toward hope long before the helicopter ever saw them. As the sound grew louder, Dylan reached for Tessa's hand. She squeezed it tightly, tears mixing with the rain on her face. They had survived the storm, crossed the river together, and discovered something far greater than rescue. Long before anyone found them, they had already found the strength to believe that neither of them would ever have to face another impossible journey alone. 3 months later, the glass walls of Mercer Dynamics reflected the same Seattle skyline that Tessa Rowan had looked at hundreds of times before, yet everything felt different. Employees still hurried through the lobby with laptops and coffee cups, meetings still filled the executive calendar, and investors still waited for quarterly reports, but the atmosphere had quietly changed. Dylan Mercer had returned to his office, though the man behind the desk was no longer defined by silence alone. He still expected excellence, but now he greeted employees by name, paused to ask about their families, and listened before making decisions. The company had noticed. So had Tessa. Standing outside the executive conference room, she watched Dylan finish speaking with a young intern who walked away, smiling with renewed confidence. She could not help smiling herself. The forest had taken away every title they once hid behind and had returned 2 people who understood the value of simple kindness. Later that afternoon, reporters gathered in the atrium as Mercer Dynamics announced the creation of the Mercer Foundation Aviation Rescue Initiative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting emergency aviation response, wilderness rescue programs, and financial assistance for survivors rebuilding their lives after disasters. Dylan stood behind the podium without the polished distance that had once defined every public appearance. "There are moments," he told the audience, "when success is measured not by what you build, but by who stands beside you when everything else disappears." As applause filled the room, he stepped away from the microphone and invited Tessa to join him on stage. She had accepted a new position as executive director of the foundation, determined to ensure that no family would ever face the uncertainty they had endured alone. Together, they unveiled the first exhibit inside the Foundation's entrance hall. Resting inside a simple glass display was the silver aviation watch. Its hands remained frozen at the exact second the aircraft had struck the mountainside. Beside the watch rested the worn brass compass that had quietly guided them east through the mountains, a reminder that hope often begins with choosing the right direction before anyone knows the destination. Beneath them, a small plaque read, "The moment time stopped reminding us of deadlines and started reminding us what truly matters." Visitors paused quietly before the display, never fully realizing how much of one extraordinary journey was contained within that silent watch. After the ceremony ended and the guests slowly departed, Dylan asked Tessa to walk with him onto the rooftop garden overlooking the city. The evening sky glowed with shades of gold and soft blue, remarkably similar to the sunset they had watched from the mountain ridge after the storm. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh rain through the air. They stood together without speaking for several moments, comfortable in the silence that had once separated them but now connected them. Dylan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and carefully unfolded the white handkerchief Tessa had placed beneath his injured shoulder in the forest. It had been washed and pressed, but one small stain remained, impossible to remove and impossible to forget. He smiled as he held it between them. "You told me to keep it," he said softly. "I never intended to let it go." Tessa laughed through tears. "I was wondering if you still had it." Dylan gently took her hands. "Do you remember the promise beside the river?" She nodded. "We both make it home." "We did." He looked into her eyes with quiet certainty. "Home was never a place. It was the person who refused to let me face life alone." Slowly, he knelt and opened a small ring box. "Tessa Rowan, you taught me that strength is not found in carrying every burden by yourself. It is found in trusting someone enough to carry them together. Will you marry me?" Tears filled her eyes before she could answer. She smiled, the same warm smile that had first appeared beside the campfire deep within the mountains. "Yes," she whispered. 1,000 times yes. As the city lights slowly illuminated the skyline around them, Dylan slipped the ring onto her finger and drew her into a gentle embrace. Far below, life continued with its endless schedules and ambitions, but neither of them measured time the way they once had. They had learned that love often begins where certainty ends, that true leadership is revealed through compassion rather than status, and that the greatest journeys are not the ones carefully planned, but the ones that transform the people brave enough to walk them together. The plane had taken away the lives they thought they wanted, but it had given them the life they had always been meant to share. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe to the Billionaire's Choice. Every week, we bring you heartwarming stories of love, destiny, and life-changing decisions. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new story.